Years before Pearl Harbor, before Europe was fully at war, China was already fighting for its survival. Millions of civilians dead, cities erased, entire armies locked in combat for 8 brutal years. This war tied down Japan's forces, shaped the outcome of World War II, and was quietly pushed out of history. This is the forgotten Chinese front, and why it mattered more than you think. When most people think of World War II, they picture D-Day beaches, European cities in ruins, Pacific Island battles, or mushroom clouds over Japan. But there's a massive gap in that story, a gap that swallowed millions of lives and fundamentally altered the course of the war. That gap is China. To understand how this war began, we need to rewind to the 1930s. Japan, despite being a relatively small island nation, had transformed itself into a modern industrial power with imperial ambitions that rivaled any European colonial empire. But Japan had a problem. It lacked natural resources. No oil, limited coal, almost no iron ore or rubber. Everything needed to fuel a modern military machine had to be imported. The solution, in the eyes of Japan's military leadership, was simple and brutal: territorial expansion. And the closest target, the most tempting prize, was China. In September 1931, Japanese officers staged the Mukden Incident, a false flag operation where they blew up a section of Japanese-owned railway in Manchuria and blamed Chinese dissidents. It was a transparent fabrication, but it gave Japan the pretext it needed. Within months, the entire region of Manchuria, an area roughly the size of France and Germany combined, was under Japanese occupation. The League of Nations condemned the invasion. Japan responded by withdrawing from the League entirely and pressing forward. The puppet state of Manchukuo was established, with the last Qing Emperor Puyi installed as a figurehead ruler. Japan had just seized one of the most resource-rich regions in Asia, and the world did nothing but file protests. For the next 6 years, Japan continued to nibble away at northern China, seizing territory bit by bit through manufactured incidents and local conflicts. Meanwhile, China was tearing itself apart from within. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government was locked in a vicious civil war with Mao Zedong's communist forces. China was divided, weakened, and fighting itself, while a predator circled. Then came the night of July 7th, 1937. On that summer night, Japanese and Chinese troops exchanged fire at the Marco Polo Bridge, a beautiful stone structure near Beijing that had stood for centuries. The details of who fired first remain disputed to this day, but the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. What started as a minor skirmish spiraled within hours into a full-scale military confrontation. Within days, Japan launched a massive invasion of northern China. This wasn't about seizing a province anymore. This was about conquering all of China and establishing Japanese hegemony over Asia. The speed and ferocity of the Japanese advance was terrifying. Beijing fell by the end of July. Tianjin followed shortly after. Japanese forces, equipped with modern artillery, aircraft, and tanks, supported by a well-trained and disciplined military, swept through northern China like a storm. Chinese forces, often poorly equipped and hampered by divided command structures, fought bravely but were systematically pushed back. But if Japan expected China to collapse quickly, they were about to learn a harsh lesson. In August 1937, fighting erupted in Shanghai, China's largest and most modern city. Chiang Kai-shek, determined to demonstrate Chinese resolve and hoping to draw international attention to the conflict, committed his best German-trained divisions to defend the city. What Japan anticipated would be a swift victory turned into a 3-month nightmare. The Battle of Shanghai became one of the largest and bloodiest urban battles in history. Over 700,000 troops clashed in the streets, factories, and ruins of this cosmopolitan city. Chinese defenders, though massively outgunned, fought with desperate courage. They turned warehouses into fortresses, fought block by block, sometimes holding positions to the last man, while Japanese bombers reduced the city to rubble around them. Western residents and journalists watched in horror as modern warfare consumed a major city. The world saw photographs of a crying Chinese baby sitting alone in the destroyed South Railway Station, one of the most iconic and heartbreaking images of the entire war. Yet, despite international outrage, no nation intervened. By November 1937, Shanghai had fallen. The Japanese had won, but at enormous cost. China lost approximately 300,000 troops. Japan suffered around 70,000 casualties. More importantly, Japan had learned that conquering China would not be quick or easy. But the worst was yet to come. With Shanghai captured, the road to Nanking lay open. Nanking, China's capital at the time, sat on the banks of the Yangtze River about 200 miles inland. Chiang Kai-shek and his government had already fled westward, abandoning the city to a demoralized garrison that had little hope of mounting an effective defense. Japanese forces surrounded the city in early December. On December 13, 1937, they entered Nanking. What happened over the next 6 weeks would become one of the darkest chapters in modern history, an atrocity so severe that it shocked even Nazi officials who were present in the city. Japanese soldiers engaged in systematic mass murder, sexual violence, and destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. Estimates vary and remain contested, but most historians believe that between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed prisoners of war were killed. Some were shot, others bayoneted, many were beheaded. Bodies littered the streets and were dumped by the thousands into the Yangtze River. Tens of thousands of women and girls, ranging from young children to elderly women, were assaulted, often repeatedly and brutally. Many were murdered afterward. Entire families were slaughtered together. The violence was random, sadistic, and overwhelming. A small group of Western missionaries and businessmen who had chosen to remain in Nanking established an international safety zone, a designated area where they tried to protect Chinese civilians. Leaders like John Rabe, a German businessman and Nazi Party member who used his status to protect Chinese refugees, and Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary who sheltered thousands of women, worked desperately to save as many lives as possible. These Westerners documented what they saw. They wrote letters, took photographs, kept detailed diaries. Their testimonies reached the outside world, and international condemnation followed. But condemnation was all that came. No country sent troops, no military intervention materialized, no economic sanctions were imposed that truly hurt Japan. The massacre of Nanking was not an isolated incident. Across occupied China, Japanese forces engaged in widespread atrocities. The Three Alls policy, kill all, burn all, loot all, was implemented in areas suspected of harboring resistance fighters. Villages were razed, civilians massacred, and entire populations terrorized into submission or death. But Japan's strategy of terror had an unintended consequence. Instead of breaking Chinese resistance, the atrocities hardened it. Nothing unites a divided nation like a common enemy that shows no mercy. After Nanjing fell, many international observers believed China's defeat was inevitable. Japan controlled the major coastal cities, the railroads, the industrial heartland. The nationalist government fled deeper into China's interior, eventually establishing a wartime capital in Chongqing, a mountainous city in Sichuan province, far from Japanese reach. But China refused to surrender. Chiang Kai-shek understood the brutal mathematics of the situation. China could not defeat Japan in conventional battles. Japanese firepower, training, logistics, and air superiority were simply too overwhelming. Every major battle China fought conventionally resulted in massive casualties and eventual retreat. So, China adopted a different strategy: trading space for time. The concept was straightforward but agonizing in its implementation. China would retreat when necessary, preserve its armies, harass Japanese supply lines, and force Japan to overextend itself across enormous distances. China would fight a war of attrition, bleeding Japan slowly while waiting for the international situation to change. Eventually, Chiang believed Japan would overreach. Other powers would enter the conflict, and China would still be standing. It was a strategy that would cost millions of Chinese lives. One of the most dramatic and controversial examples came in June 1938. To slow the Japanese advance toward central China, Chinese forces deliberately breached the dikes of the Yellow River, one of China's major waterways. The resulting floods were catastrophic. Water inundated 11 cities and over 4,000 villages across 3 provinces. An estimated 500,000 to 900,000 Chinese civilians died in the immediate floods and subsequent famine. Millions more were displaced, losing their homes, their livelihoods, everything. It was an almost incomprehensible sacrifice, but it achieved its immediate military objective. The floods disrupted Japanese supply lines, destroyed bridges and roads, and delayed their advance by several months, buying precious time for Chinese forces to regroup and for vital industries to be relocated further inland. Throughout 1938, massive battles raged across central China. At Taizhuang in March and April, Chinese forces achieved a rare major victory, destroying an entire Japanese division and killing over 20,000 Japanese troops. It was a desperately needed morale boost that proved Chinese forces could win under the right circumstances. But such victories were exceptions. At Wuhan, from June to October 1938, another colossal battle unfolded. Over 1 million soldiers clashed in a campaign that sprawled across multiple provinces. When it ended, Wuhan had fallen to Japan, but both sides had suffered staggering casualties. China lost an estimated 250,000 troops. Japan lost around 100,000. By late 1939, Japan controlled much of eastern China, the major cities, the coast, the railways. But controlling cities and controlling China were two very different things. Japan now faced a problem that would haunt it for the rest of the war. Occupying China required enormous resources and manpower, but controlling China seemed impossible. Japanese forces held the cities and major transportation routes, but the countryside remained contested. Chinese forces both nationalist and communist, continued to operate throughout occupied territories. Guerrilla warfare became endemic. Japanese supply convoys were ambushed, isolated garrisons attacked, collaborators assassinated, railways sabotaged. The communist forces, operating primarily in northern China behind Japanese lines, became particularly effective at guerrilla warfare. Mao Zedong's strategy emphasized mobile warfare, winning over local populations and avoiding major battles while inflicting maximum disruption. Communist base areas expanded throughout occupied China, building a foundation of popular support that would prove decisive in the coming civil war. Japan responded with increasing brutality. Villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters were burned. Civilians were executed en masse as warnings. The three-alls policy was implemented with systematic cruelty. But brutality only generated more resistance, more hatred, more determination to fight. By 1940, Japan had over 1 million troops stationed in China, with hundreds of thousands more in Manchuria. These were troops that couldn't be deployed elsewhere, equipment that couldn't be sent to other fronts, resources consumed in an endless occupation that generated no strategic benefit and never seemed to achieve final victory. China, meanwhile, continued to fight. The nationalist government in Chongqing, though isolated and under constant aerial bombardment, refused to surrender or negotiate. Chinese forces continued to tie down Japanese armies in countless small engagements and occasional major battles. The war ground on with no end in sight. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland and Europe exploded into war. Global attention shifted westward. China's struggle, already underreported in Western media, became an afterthought. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. Japan's surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet brought the United States into the war and fundamentally changed the strategic picture. Suddenly, China was no longer fighting alone. It was now part of the Allied coalition against the Axis powers. But for China, remarkably little changed. American aid began flowing to China, but getting it there was nearly impossible. Japan controlled the Chinese coast and had cut the Burma Road, the vital overland supply route from British Burma into southwestern China. The only remaining supply line was by air over the Himalayas, a route that pilots called the Hump. Flying the Hump was extraordinarily dangerous. Pilots had to navigate through the world's highest mountains, often in terrible weather, with inadequate navigation equipment and constant risk of Japanese interceptors. Hundreds of planes and their crews were lost. The supplies that did get through were never enough to equip and supply China's massive armies adequately. America sent military advisors, led by General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell, to work with Chiang Kai-shek and help reorganize Chinese forces. But the relationship was poisonous from the start. Stilwell, a brilliant tactician but a terrible diplomat, openly despised Chiang, calling him the Peanut in his private diaries. Chiang, dealing with enormous political and military pressures, viewed Stilwell as arrogant and ignorant of Chinese realities. The two clashed constantly over strategy, resources, and priorities. Stilwell wanted to use Chinese troops aggressively to reopen the Burma Road. Chiang, mindful that he would need his best troops for the inevitable resumption of civil war with the Communists after Japan was defeated, was reluctant to commit them to offensives that primarily served Allied rather than Chinese interests. The Western Allies, meanwhile, adopted a Germany-first strategy, prioritizing the European theater over the Pacific. Within the Pacific theater itself, resources flowed primarily to the American island-hopping campaign and General Douglas MacArthur's drive through the Southwest Pacific. China received what was left over, which was never enough. While the world's attention focused on Europe and the Pacific Islands, the war in China continued to exact an almost incomprehensible human cost. Between 1937 and 1945, an estimated 15 to 20 million Chinese died as a result of the war. Some estimates go even higher, reaching toward 25 million. The uncertainty itself speaks to the scale of the catastrophe. The death toll was so vast and the chaos so complete that precise accounting became impossible. Of those millions, approximately 3 to 4 million were military casualties. Soldiers killed in battle, died of wounds, or perished from disease. The rest were civilians. Civilians killed in massacres like Nanjing. Civilians who died in the aerial bombing of cities like Chongqing, which endured years of relentless Japanese bombing raids. Civilians who starved when their farms were burned and their crops destroyed. Civilians who died from disease epidemics that ravaged regions where infrastructure had collapsed. And civilians who died from biological warfare. Japan's Unit 731, based in Manchuria under the command of General Shiro Ishii, conducted horrific biological warfare experiments and operations. Chinese prisoners and civilians were subjected to vivisection, infected with plague and other diseases, frozen alive to study frostbite, and subjected to other unspeakable experiments. But Unit 731 wasn't just conducting research. It was deploying biological weapons in combat. Plague-infected fleas were released over Chinese cities. Wells were poisoned with cholera and typhoid. Contaminated food was distributed. Over 200,000 Chinese are estimated to have died from biological warfare attacks alone. The economic devastation was equally catastrophic. Entire regions were depopulated. Cities were reduced to ruins. Farmland was abandoned, flooded, or deliberately destroyed. Industries were looted or bombed. The war set back China's economic development by decades. And through all of this, China's internal divisions never truly healed. The Nationalist Communist United Front against Japan was always fragile and incomplete. Both sides hoarded weapons and resources, positioning themselves for the inevitable civil war that would resume once Japan was defeated. In some areas, nationalist and communist forces spent as much energy fighting each other as fighting the Japanese. By 1944, Japan was clearly losing the wider war. American forces had broken through Japan's Pacific defensive perimeter, seizing key islands and establishing bases from which to bomb the Japanese home islands. The Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, had been crippled at Midway in 1942 and further shattered in subsequent battles. Japan's empire was contracting, its economy was collapsing, and its cities were being reduced to ashes by American bombing. But in China, Japan launched one final massive offensive. Operation Ichi-Go, beginning in April 1944, was one of the largest military operations in history. Japan committed over 500,000 troops and 800 tanks to a coordinated offensive designed to accomplish several objectives. capture American air bases in southern China, from which B-29 bombers were attacking Japanese shipping and territory, open a continuous land route from Manchuria through China to Southeast Asia, and deliver a knockout blow to nationalist Chinese forces. The operation was devastatingly successful in tactical terms. Japanese forces, despite being overstretched elsewhere, demonstrated that they could still mount major offensives and win battles. They overran huge swaths of territory, captured the targeted American air bases, and inflicted heavy casualties on Chinese forces. Some nationalist armies, demoralized and poorly supplied after years of grinding warfare, collapsed quickly. Others fought stubbornly but were overwhelmed. Operation Ichi-Go captured more territory than any previous Japanese offensive, involving combat across thousands of miles. But strategically, it was meaningless. Japan lacked the resources to hold or effectively administer the captured territories. The air bases they seized were soon out of range of American bombers anyway, as the U.S. captured the Mariana Islands, which provided better bases for the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. The operation further exhausted Japan's military. Troops and supplies poured into the China theater that couldn't be spared for the defense of more critical positions. The offensive succeeded brilliantly on the battlefield, while accomplishing nothing for Japan's deteriorating strategic position. By mid-1945, Japan was collapsing. American forces were closing in on the home islands. Japanese cities were being incinerated by massive firebombing raids. The Japanese Navy barely existed. The economy was in ruins. Japan's situation was hopeless, but its military leadership refused to surrender, preparing instead for a fanatical defense of the home islands that would cost millions of lives on both sides. Then the Soviet Union intervened. On August 9, 1945, just hours after the atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki, the Soviet Red Army invaded Manchuria. Over 1.5 million Soviet troops, with thousands of tanks and aircraft, poured across the border in a massive coordinated offensive. Japan's Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, but now a shadow of its former self, was annihilated in less than 2 weeks. The Soviet invasion, combined with the atomic bombings, finally broke the deadlock in Tokyo. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese had ever heard their emperor's voice. After 8 years, the war in China was over. Chinese casualties, 15 to 20 million dead, millions more wounded, entire regions devastated. Japanese casualties in the China theater, over 1.1 million military casualties, though many of these occurred in the final Soviet offensive in Manchuria. China had survived, but at a cost almost beyond comprehension. So why did this massive conflict, this war that killed more people than all combatants in World War I combined, fade so completely from Western memory? The reasons are complex and troubling. First, China's civil war resumed almost immediately. Within months of Japan's surrender, nationalist and communist forces were fighting each other again. The Civil War was brutal, chaotic, and by 1949, Mao's communists had won. Chiang's nationalists fled to Taiwan, where they established a rival government. For the next several decades, the People's Republic of China was isolated from the West, locked behind what Churchill called the bamboo curtain. During the Cold War, it became convenient for Western powers to downplay Communist China's contribution to defeating fascism. Second, the narrative of World War II that developed in Western countries didn't have room for China's complex story. The Western narrative focused on clear, dramatic events: Pearl Harbor, D-Day, the Battle of Britain, island hopping in the Pacific. China's war was grinding, attritional, often confusing, complicated by internal political divisions, and lacking the clear narrative arc that Western audiences expected. It was easier to tell stories about heroic American Marines or British resistance to the Blitz than to explain the intricacies of Chinese strategy and politics. Third, the political situation in China itself complicated historical memory. The nationalist government that had actually directed most of the fighting against Japan lost the Civil War and ended up exiled in Taiwan. The communist government that took power had its own narrative to promote, emphasizing communist resistance while downplaying nationalist contributions. For decades, historical memory in China itself was contested, politicized, and incomplete. Fourth, there's an uncomfortable truth that Western powers, particularly Britain and the United States, largely abandoned China to fight alone for years. Despite China being an allied power after Pearl Harbor, despite the enormous sacrifices Chinese forces made, the aid that reached China was always insufficient. Resources flowed primarily to other theaters. Chinese pleas for more support were met with sympathetic words, but limited action. After the war, it was easier to forget China's contribution than to acknowledge how little help had been provided. And finally, Japan itself, for decades after the war, downplayed or denied the atrocities committed in China. Japanese textbooks glossed over events like the massacre of Nanjing or Unit 731's biological warfare. Without a prominent defeated power acknowledging its crimes, as Germany eventually did with the Holocaust, the enormity of China's suffering remained underappreciated internationally. But here's the truth that cannot be forgotten. China's resistance was absolutely critical to the Allied victory in World War II. Not peripheral, not secondary, critical. Consider this. At its peak, Japan had over 1 million troops stationed in China and hundreds of thousands more in Manchuria. These were troops that couldn't defend the Pacific Islands against American assault. These were soldiers who couldn't reinforce Burma when the British and Chinese counterattacked. These were divisions that couldn't be deployed to other theaters where they were desperately needed. Every Japanese soldier pinned down in China was one less that American, British, Australian, or other Allied forces had to face. Every ton of supplies Japan sent to China was material that couldn't go elsewhere. Every casualty Japan suffered in China was a soldier who couldn't fight anywhere else. The counterfactual is stark. Imagine if China had surrendered in 1938 or 1939, as many expected it would. Japan would have freed up over 1 million troops and vast amounts of resources. These forces could have been deployed to fortify Pacific Islands more heavily, making the American island-hopping campaign far bloodier and slower. They could have been used to invade and occupy more of Southeast Asia, seizing more resources to fuel Japan's war machine. They could have threatened India, Australia, or pushed further into the Pacific. China's resistance prevented all of that. By refusing to surrender, by trading space for time, by fighting a grinding war of attrition, China tied down Japanese forces for 8 years, and prevented Japan from exploiting its early victories. China's resistance also had profound effects on Japan's economy and morale. The war in China was a bottomless pit that consumed resources and generated nothing but more warfare. Japan poured men, equipment, and supplies into China and got back only casualties and guerrilla attacks. The occupation drained Japan economically and psychologically, contributing to the erosion of Japanese military capability that allowed the Allies to push back elsewhere. And on a human level, every month that China continued fighting was another month that other nations and peoples weren't facing the full brunt of Japanese aggression. China absorbed horrendous punishment that might otherwise have fallen on other populations. The sacrifice was involuntary and unchosen, but it shaped the course of the entire war. The forgotten Chinese front wasn't a sideshow. It wasn't a minor theater. It was one of the central campaigns of World War II, as significant as any front in Europe and more costly in lives than almost any other campaign in the entire war. For 8 years, from 1937 to 1945, China fought for survival against an enemy that showed no mercy. Millions died, soldiers and civilians, young and old, in battles and massacres and famines. Cities were destroyed, entire regions were devastated, the cost was almost unimaginable, but China never surrendered. That resistance, that refusal to give in despite overwhelming odds and minimal international support, fundamentally shaped the outcome of World War II. It tied down Japan's military for years, preventing Japan from consolidating its empire or defending it effectively when the Allies struck back. It demonstrated that even the most powerful military machine could be ground down by determined resistance. It proved that wars aren't won simply by winning battles. They're won by refusing to lose. The next time you see a documentary about World War II that leaps from the invasion of Poland in 1939 to Pearl Harbor in 1941 without mentioning China, remember, millions were already dead. One of the world's oldest civilizations was already locked in an existential struggle, and the outcome of that struggle determined whether Japan's empire would dominate Asia for generations or collapse in defeat. China's war against Japan wasn't a footnote. It wasn't background noise. It was one of the defining conflicts of the 20th century, and it deserves to be remembered as such, not as the forgotten front, but as one of the great campaigns of World War II. Because those millions who died, those soldiers who fought, those civilians who endured, they weren't footnotes to history. They were history, and their sacrifice helped save the world. If you enjoy deep, long-form World War II documentaries like this, consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow.